On the Common Link Theory, CLT, by Fahad Alhomoudi, Mcgill University, doctoral thesis, October 4th, 2006. Chapter 4. Traditionists' articulation of the common link and Schacht's misconception of their scholarship. Traditionists on the common link phenomenon. The common link theory has long been a controversial and complicated phenomenon, even amongst traditionists themselves. Not only do the evaluations of the traditionists on the different types of isolated hadith vary, but even their terminology for these types of hadith have changed and developed over time. To fully understand the common link theory according to the traditionists requires an in-depth study, a study of its complex history and taking into account diverse and evolving terms, ideas and positions. Such an investigation has not been undertaken in its totality by either Schacht or his opponents. This chapter aims to address this task. Needless to say, Schacht's understanding of the CLT contradicts that of the Muhaddiths. Although the latter acknowledge the existence of the CL phenomenon, their characterization of its elements and the terms they use to describe it are completely different. Tafarrud, a comparable term used by the Muhaddiths to describe the CL, is perhaps the most complicated issue that hadith critics have discussed. Before criticizing Schacht's misinterpretation of Tafarrud in Part 2 of this chapter, Part 1 will discuss 3 important points of background information about hadith, which are necessary to clarify subtle distinctions of definition, which lie behind Schacht's erroneous interpretation of the traditionist scholarship. The first of these topics will be an overview of Schacht's and the Muhaddith's divergent definition of Sunnah. Second, an account of their different classification of sound and unsound hadiths will be explored. Finally, explication will be given of traditionist definition of fard and closely related concepts, a term generally referring to hadith transmitted by a single individual that leads to a single line of descent. This is necessary because contention about this kind of hadith constitutes the essential problem in the CLT. 1. The meaning of Sunnah. First of all, the meaning of Sunnah is central to the conflict between Schacht and the Muhaddiths. The latter defined the Sunnah as being the entirety of the deeds, speech and tacit confirmations of the Prophet, while Schacht divides this term according to its use in 3 different historical phases. According to him, the pre-Islamic period was the first phase of Sunnah, when it referred to the normative model of inherited custom. Whatever the forefathers had done deserved to be imitated. The second phase was that of the ancient schools of law, who changed the use of this term to represent the common practice during the Umayyad period. He states, Sunnah or practice, amal or well-established precedent, Sunnah Madiyya or ancient practice, amal qadim. This practice partly reflects the actual custom of the local community, but it also contains a theoretical or ideal element so that it comes to mean normative Sunnah, the usage as it ought to be. End of quote. The ancient schools did not sustain this meaning of Sunnah. Iraqi scholars of the early 2nd century of Islam transferred its limited political and theological use into a legal context, identifying it with the practice of the local community and the doctrine of its scholars. Later on, Shafi'i articulated the final phase of the term Sunnah, which he associated exclusively with prophetic tradition. Since then, Muhaddiths have used this meaning for the term Sunnah, while at the same time recognizing the different phases that the term Sunnah had gone through. This can be seen from their discussion of the use Sunnah in the early context, such as Ibn Salah, who died in 642, wonders. When a companion describes something using the term Sunnah, if he is referring to the 2nd or 3rd phase of the Sunnah. Muhaddiths have elaborated on this question through the meaning of marfu' and mawquf, and concluded that whenever the term Sunnah appears, it refers to the prophetic Sunnah unless stated otherwise. Guilaim claimed that Schacht misunderstood the correct meaning of the Sunnah, and the very premise based upon this erroneous definition will perforce lead to inaccurate conclusions. In connection with the whittling down of the meaning of the term Sunnah to the practice of the Prophet, it is important to observe the Sunnah Madiyya is not, as Schacht translates, a past Sunnah, but an established practice of the present going back to the past. So we should read in 3 places a present Sunnah going back to the Prophet. Critically assessing Schacht's definition of the term Sunnah, however, requires further investigation into this confusion surrounding its interpretation. In his article, The Concept of Sunnah, Ijtihad and Ijma' in the early period, Fazl Rahman mentions that among Western scholars, Ignaz Goldziher was the first to maintain that immediately after the advent of the Prophet, this practice and conduct came to constitute the Sunnah of the young Muslim community. Hence, the notion of idealness embodied in the pre-Islamic Sunnah had ceased to apply. In other words, Goldziher defined Sunnah as the Muhaddiths defined it, which corresponded to the third phase of Schacht's scheme. Goldziher's definition did not last for long amongst Orientalists, with Snook Haronji, for instance, claiming a normative definition for Sunnah, which Schacht would later apply to his second phase. He stated that the Muslims themselves kept adding into the Sunnah of the Prophet until almost all products of Muslim thought and practice came to be embodied in it. On the opposing side, Leymans and Margot Lioth regarded the Sunnah as being entirely drawn from Arab customs, pre-Islamic and post-Islamic. Obviously, this definition conforms to what Schacht described as Sunnah in the first phase of the scheme. Rahman, in fact, suggests that Schacht, in his Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, took over this view from Margot Lioth and Leymans, where he seeks to maintain that concept. Sunnah of the Prophet was relatively a late concept. For the early generations of Muslims, Sunnah meant the practice of the Muslims themselves. Rahman, nevertheless, disagrees with all these definitions and presents a more comprehensive and congruous definition as follows. Sunnah is a behavioural concept, whether applied or physical or mental acts, and further denotes not merely a single act as such, but insofar as this act is actually repeated or potentially repeated. In other words, a sunnah is a law or behaviour, whether instanced once or often. Similar to Rahman's revised definition, but not as accurate, is that of Azami, who tries to link the term back to the time of the Prophet, stating, anyone can establish a sunnah, good or bad, if it is followed by others, as the life of the Prophet was the model for all Muslims to follow. The expression Sunnah of the Prophet came into use in the life of the Prophet and was even used by him. Sometimes the norms drawn analogically from the practice of the sayings were also called Sunnah. Although Azami agrees with Rahman in giving the Sunnah a broader meaning, he fails to distinguish between the use of the word of the Prophet's time and its use by the Muhaddiths. The word Sunnah, as found in the Quran and the prophetic tradition, does not have the exact same meaning as it does in the later Hadith books. In other words, both Azami and Rahman failed to distinguish between the different senses and uses of the term Sunnah. The Prophet did not necessarily give the word Sunnah the same meaning used by Shafi'i and later Muhaddiths. This conflict was not limited to the science of prophetic tradition, but emerged in related fields like Sirah. Jurayz, for example, criticizes Brockelmann's claim that most of the prophetic tradition appeared 2 centuries later as a source of Muslim theology. Jurayz similarly disagrees with Goldziher and Schacht, who, according to him, advanced the same argument as Brockelmann. Stay tuned.